Well, we're here again today with Clive Vanderburgh, and he's agreed to be interviewed again. This time, we're talking about the very first show that he worked on for TV Ontario. Last time we chatted, Clive, you remember we talked about Today's Special and
Yep.
the real legacy that that's been in the minds of many Canadian folks. But today we're talking about a show that maybe perhaps isn't remembered by as many people, but for those who remember, they certainly remember it clearly, and that's Cucumber. So before we even jump in to talk specifically about the show Cucumber, Clive, can you just give us a snapshot of what educational television looked like in the 1970s when you were coming into TV Ontario for the first time? What was the environment? What did educational TV look like at that time, and what was the objective and what you were doing and creating there at TVO?
We had TV Ontario started as the Ontario Educational Communications Authority, and it was an idea that Bill Davis, who was the education minister at the time, eventually became premier, and Ran Ide. Ran Ide was the first chairman of TV Ontario. He'd been in Thunder Bay as a principal, I believe, and was very interested in media. And there were a lot of people who wanted to tap the opportunities that presented themselves in television. And so TV Ontario got a license from the Ontario government to have a transmitter. And before that, there had been an organization called META, I think was the Metropolitan Education Television Authority. So there were some people in the ministry who were making videos and individual shows and that kind of thing, but this was an opportunity to have a station wholly attached to for educational programming.
Hmm.
And as you can imagine, it wasn't universally loved by everybody. The few private broadcasters that were in the market thought that this was not a good idea to have a publicly funded educational program, educational station competing with them for viewers. And although TV Ontario wasn't commercial, the private broadcasters were, and they were a little afraid that they would siphon away some of the audience for the commercial stations, and I think primarily CFTO and Agincourt. So and all these things are always political issues too. So there is some interesting things that happened. At that time, CBC. It was a public broadcaster, but a public as opposed to an educational broadcaster. So the mandate was educational programming, so that it would be unique and distinct from entertainment programming or public broadcasting that kind of spanned cultural agendas and also general interest arts and news. So I think TVO wasn't to do news. They also set up they were on Bayview Avenue, and they rented studios. So of course the commercial guys who actually owned studios liked that part of it, because they thought that TV Ontario would go up to their studios and rent their studios, and they'd make money from that. And when OECA became TV Ontario, they went to Yonge and Eglinton and were in the Transamerica building there, and had a very small studio in the basement. I think that was part of a saw-off, so that they didn't have the great big studios like the ones that John Bassett had at Agincourt, and so couldn't do big time programs. Would have to go out and rent studios from the private broadcasters when they wanted to do big shows.
I always
So
find it.
I
I was just going to say, I
go
always find
ahead.
it interesting how, so many of these shows are so memorable, but the conditions in which they were created under were quite scarce and just really limited back in the day, it sounds.
Well, it's interesting. The one of the big challenges when you're doing anything creative is to take the opportunities that present themselves and try to make the most of what you've got. And one of the things that TV Ontario had that other broadcasters didn't have, because it was just being developed in the early '70s, is they put in quite a number of edit suites. I did work at the CBC, and for those people who know Mr. Dressup, Mr. Dressup was shot live to tape. He did 5 shows in 2.5 days. So half a day was, you rehearse it and then you shoot it live to tape. You go to lunch and you shoot another show live to tape. TV, but they had a big studio at Studio 4, and they had, crews and, but TV Ontario didn't have big crews, but they had lots of post-production facilities. And so and because they had post-production facilities, you were able to shoot shows in small bits and then edit them together and make them, tighter and more,
Coherent.
a little, more contemporary than a live show. And so shows like less Cucumber, but shows like Read Along and Math Patrol and Math Makers and Today's Special, science shows and that kind of stuff were heavily edited. And that was one of the reasons, so they couldn't have a big studio, but they could have lots of edit suites. And so, the shows that come out of it are kind of a function of the gear that you have to exploit. So that was some of the things that early producers did, because if you went to the CBC, you could have a crew of 30. You couldn't have a crew of 30 at TV Ontario, but you could shoot small segments and then edit them together. So.
Now, from what I understand, Cucumber was your first show for TV Ontario. Can you bring us back to its genesis and help us understand why the show was created? I guess this would be going back to 1974. Before we started, you were reminding me that that's almost 40 years ago.
Yeah, well, this is why, and all your viewers will know that you know more about my career than I know myself. So so here we go. I had actually worked on adult programming at TV Ontario before that.
Okay.
And one of the things that it happened that my boss Vera Novakowski was she had a mixed mandate. She had one of teacher education programming and early childhood education programming, and I'd been working in the teacher education side. And I said to her one day that I would really like to try my hand at some children's programs, and as it happens, TV Ontario was developing what was called block programming, and it seems old hat now, but most broadcasters at that time were generalist broadcasters, and they'd have a talk show on this, and then they'd have a cartoon, and then they'd have some music, and then they'd have whatever, and the audience had trouble finding shows suitable for them. They had to be right there at 8 o'clock at night. The American stations were more advanced than the Canadian ones in terms of their programming. But Chris Johnson, the station manager, started this idea of block programming, and he started a Saturday morning block of children's programs. And now it's a little, when you think of half the day at TV Ontario being children's programs now, and there being YTV and Nickelodeon and those kinds of stations, they didn't exist at that time. So this was kind of a big deal. So they had programs that they had bought, and they had Polka Dot Door and those kinds of shows, but they wanted to build they wanted to build critical mass around children's programs. And so John Surrett, who was in charge of older kids, grade 4 to grade 8, that kind of thing, started a program called Monkey Bars. And it was just a terrific program for kids that age. And and my boss Vera Novakowski thought, well, she should have one for younger children as well to go into the Saturday morning block, and gave me and said to me, well, why don't you develop a pilot for a show? They had a little bit of money, and I think I don't know when we started, but it had to be done by March 31st, because that was the end of the government fiscal year.
Yeah.
So you had to create it, shoot the pilot, edit it, all that kind of stuff. Again, another kind of odd thing, but for government broadcasting, this was what you had to do, and it better be finished in the can by March 31st, or all the money that went into the show went into the next year. And so I was asked to do a show for preschool kids, and there wasn't much more that I was asked to do. And I went out to schools and I did my due diligence and asked teachers what they were looking for. And it seems strange in this time to think that ecology and that kind of stuff was like a new subject in school,
Right.
and a new idea. But it was the 1970s, and so I thought of, we'd do a show on ecology, and they wanted it to be a Canadian show, and so a little bit like like the Hosers on Second City with
Right.
their Canadian thing. I thought, well, if you're going to be Canadian, what the heck? Let's go with a moose and a beaver, and so I started with that, and with an ecological theme.
Okay.
And in fact, I know a lot of people think of Cucumber. It's the Children's Underground Club of United Moose and Beaver for Enthusiastic Reporters, but the original title was Cucumber Children's Underground Club for United Moose and Beavers for Ecological Respect.
Oh, okay.
And after we did the pilots, it was considered that it might be a little limiting to do the series in just an ecology, so we put Enthusiastic Reporters in instead, and thus history is made.
So little of the show has sadly survived the years. I think that there is, a brief clip on YouTube, and then of course I was able to uncover the intro a number of years ago. And in a weird kind of way, it's kind of surprising, just because I know that it created in 1974. You guys would have just been in production that year. Or did it go into 75 and 76? Did you just do one year production?
No, it went in. It was we did the pilots up to March 31st. The pilot before March 31st did 13 shows the next year and 13 shows the year after.
Right. So it's the tape that I got the intro off of was from 1990. So it just goes to show that TVOntario really saw value in broadcasting that 15 years after it had been created. But the point is that not a lot has really existed. It's really become a rarity. Can you you've talked a little bit about the plot, and you mentioned the main characters. What else can you tell us about some of the themes that you talked about in the series? You talked a little bit about ecology. What else was the series built around? What other types of subjects and things did the series tackle?
Well, the idea was to do shows that were based on themes that teachers might be able to create units in the classroom around.
Okay.
So this was early on. There was a VIPS, which was a programming service, a tape service that teachers could write in or phone into TVOntario and order tapes and play the tapes in the classroom. So the idea was that if you did a show on weather, that if they were doing a unit on weather in the classroom, this would help stimulate, discussion in the classroom. And because the show was meant to be interactive, the kids could do their project and then send in their reports to the show, and then Beaver, read the reports in the mailroom. And so it became we were trying to make television as interactive as possible at that time. I mean, it's, obviously a little, quite different than now, when so many things can be, we can interact in so many different ways. But the postal mail was the way we did it at that time. But interestingly, I'll take you back to the pilots. We sometimes you do a pilot and you just, things work so well, you just go on and you do it. But in this particular case, we did the pilots, and remember, this was awfully early in my producing career. In fact, they didn't call me a producer; I was a project leader at the time. And we had a terrific crew trying to put together a show, and you're building these costumes of Moose and Beaver. So the people who played Moose and Beaver in the pilots didn't play Moose and Beaver in the series. And but in addition to Moose and Beaver, there were two live hosts of the show in the pilot. And I think this is a riot. Heather Conkey was one of the hosts of Cucumber, and a little known guy called Martin Short was the other host of the show, and so it was Moose and Beaver and Heather and Marty doing the show, and we did the pilot. And so it had jokes and songs and riddles, and it also had an adventure part of it. I think a 6-minute filmed mystery in it called Zachariah Gibson's Magic Trunk. Now, Zachariah, when we went to series, we made a number of changes. First of all, Zachariah Gibson's Magic Trunk, we took that out because we didn't think there was enough time in a 30-minute show to have that, and that spun off into a show that Jeremy Pollack made called Timothy Pilgrim. And we also thought, and this is here I decided to go with Moose and Beaver instead of Martin Short. So so I take some credit for Martin Short being available to go off to Second City and be brilliant. He was absolutely spectacular, as Heather was in the pilots. Marty came back and did a guest shot on the show. But remember, this was the early '70s, and Second City was just starting, and all these brilliant young performers were in the Toronto market, and we got to use a bunch of them. So it was it was terrific.
I tell you, what I would pay to see that pilot, but sadly, I bet it's locked forever within the vaults of TVO, as so much of this great stuff is. Can you remind us just in general terms, what was the plot of the show? Like, I definitely remember the clubhouse and just two pals, Moose and Beaver. What else can you tell us about the general plot of the show?
Well, they were in charge of the Cucumber Club, and the kids in the Cucumber Club were helped them out with things, right? So there was always a guest that came to the show. They always pitched to a member of the Cucumber Club, a kid that we filmed out who had some experience in the subject matter that they were talking about. So somebody who had experience doing weather projects, or who knew an awful lot about dinosaurs or whatever, because we were trying to show children on television as opposed to just adults on television,
right?
And so there were, I'm trying to think of what the elements were. There were little things we called animal quickies, which were jokes from animals, and riddles, the songs, the mail room, the films with kids, and so it was a variety show with kind of an adventure that was supposed to happen every week, and the kids' input to the show.
Now, you mentioned that the pilot and the original well, I don't know if the pilot was filmed this way, but you said the original concept, the acronym was different. By the time you got to the pilot, had it been changed to Enthusiastic Reporters, or was it still Ecological Respect?
Ecological Respect was the pilot.
Right.
Now, here's a trivia thing for you, Travis. That do you know who wrote the pilot?
No.
Of Cucumber?
No.
The guy's name's Roy Moore, and he also wrote one of the first slasher films in Canadian film history called Black Christmas.
Oh, wow!
So he was an absolutely wonderful writer, but he certainly had a variety of genres that he was working in at the time. The series was written by Joanne Hauser, who wrote Math Patrol and Math Makers and a lot of Today's Special with me.
Yeah.
It was certainly an interesting time. It's not too much to say that television was still in its infancy in 1974. It certainly was. I was a newbie in television, but there weren't that many shows being produced in Toronto at that time.
Now I'm curious to know, for the pilot, did you bother with the animated opening in the song, and would that have been changed after the change of the name of the show, the acronym? Because the words are in the theme song.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I was thinking about that. I don't think the animation was done for the pilot because I think the pilot was done relatively quickly before the end of the fiscal year. I know Joyce Cosby designed the animation, and Wayne Trickett Productions did the animation. But I think it was done for the series because it's animations are expensive, and we needed to amortize it over the 13 weeks of the series.
Why the word cucumber, and where did you come up with that acronym? Did you make it fit?
Uh, you know, uh, Gosh, sometimes you just want to be silly,
Sure.
and that was it. When you're devising a title for a show, you're always trying to look for something that will have some cachet,
Yeah.
it will catch people's attention, and it's kind of like writing a song lyric. Every once in a while, you come up with something and you say, that's pretty cool. And, you're never really sure. And so you just, as a creative person, you just kind of bluff your way through the first thing and say, well, other people thought it was pretty good. So, you know, well, and Moose and Beaver, I did have to find a word that had an M and a B in it,
There you go. Well,
yeah.
I have a little sound clip here, and we'll just enjoy this together really quickly.
Okay.
Come and sing a song of the forest. Let us sing a song about animal kind. Water, air, and land spread out before us. Searching for some answers, seeing what we can find. Children's Underground Club of United Moose and Beaver, for enthusiastic reporters. Children's Underground Club of United Moose and Beaver, for enthusiastic reporters.
Now, the one thing that and I know I've told you this in private, Clive, but the one thing I've always appreciated about you and your creations is that you're no token musician. Like anybody who knows music can listen to even the chord progression in that theme song that you composed, and it's not your standard 1 4 5 minor 6. It's something interesting in it, and I think it reveals your training. And you probably think nothing of it, but when I heard it, I'm just like, say what you want. This is hooky, and sure enough, when people talk about the show, they remember the theme song. So,
Ah,
what do you remember about composing that little ditty?
well, you know, you just do the best. You do the best you can. You wanted it to be upbeat, and you need it to say what you needed to say quickly. I mean, another, I think, a really interesting story behind it. It's, again, remember we were talking before about using there are all sorts of restrictions in producing television, and kind of figuring out how to get the biggest bang for the buck. Well, I'd worked on a show before where they had done a theme song, and they had all these different voices in the thing. They brought ACTRA members in to do the voices because it was someone who had produced at the CBC, and the CBC had an agreement with ACTRA about buyouts for themes. So the CBC producer thought he could do the same thing. Went to TV Ontario, had these actors do it. Found out that TV Ontario didn't have a buyout for actors for themes, and so they went into studio for 15 minutes and had to be paid for 13 different shows. As if they were in
Wow.
13 different shows. So it was important in this theme song because TV Ontario had an agreement with the Musicians Union for a buyout, but not ACTRA for the buyout. That it had to be sung by somebody who was in the band, who was in the
Oh,
Musicians Union,
so who's
and
singing
had to
it?
be playing an instrument, right? So I sang the theme song, and I did the background singing for the theme song, because it saved the show a lot of money.
Wow. Well,
So,
that's a great piece of trivia there. So that is your voice on the theme song. I never knew that.
That is my voice.
And it sounds
Background
it
and
sounds great.
foreground, you know.
It,
Yeah.
it
I
sounds
got a lot smarter later on by hiring really brilliant singers.
well. I think it sounds just fine, and I think it's just so interesting that so many people will remember the characters, but they will remember that theme song. In fact, I think when I posted that, one of the first comments that I got from a fan was, "I've been waiting 30 years to hear that again." So it stuck, and I just love how it's totally 70s and how it was produced with the piano and some of the claps in the background. I think it's great. So, how many episodes? You alluded to it, but just so I can get clarification, how many episodes were created of Cucumber, and did you produce and write music for every single one?
There were 26 of them to the best of my memory, and remember it is 40 years ago. Yes, I produced and wrote music for all of them. The writer Joanne Hauser wrote all the lyrics, and I wrote all the music. We recorded the music at Manta.
Okay.
Manta Sound, great recording studio in Toronto, and then the performers lip sync to the recordings.
Did Joanne write the lyrics to the theme song as well?
No, I wrote the lyrics to the theme song.
Okay. So you would have like musicians do the actual vocals on the tracks. Who would sing for the role of Moose and
No, the performers, Alex Laurier, who was Moose, and Nicky Tilrow, who was Beaver, sang the songs that Moose and Beaver sang.
Gotcha.
Of course, there was no lip sync for them because they were behind the masks.
Right.
When live people came to the show, they pre-recorded the songs at Manta and then lip synced to the songs.
Now, we talked already about Martin Short. Rumor has it was that John Candy made a guest appearance on the show. Was that true as well?
Yeah, that's yes, John. I did. That was John Candy's first musical performance ever. You know, so or first professional one. He played a character called Weatherman. Actually, the clip of John Candy doing Weatherman is available on the TVO website.
Okay.
So you can see. I think there's about a 4-minute clip with him kibitzing with Moose and Beaver, and then singing his song. And he was a very nervous young man when he was recording that song. But he was just he was absolutely stunningly brilliant. Yeah.
So two people from that went on to do Second City. Is there anybody else that again, because the stuff isn't available, it's not like I can go back and review it. Is there anybody else notable that you had on as a guest appearance? You mentioned Heather Conkey, John Candy, Martin Short. Anybody else off the top of your head?
Rosemary Radcliffe, who had done a lot of Second City work, did the show, and I regret that I can't remember all of the people that were on the show, but I'm sure certainly TVOntario has them in their BPNs, the basic program numbers, so that would all be available. One of the really the kind of interesting stories I'd mentioned that we had that we talked to young children. We went out and interviewed them, and on a show on senses, we went out and interviewed a young boy who was blind, and we did 3 little segments with him at his cottage in north of Toronto, and one about what it was like to be blind, and how he learned about he was sighted at birth, and then was going to lose his eyes and lose his sight, and in the final segment we shot him because he loved music, right? We shot him. He was listening to records and watching him. He had Braille on the records, and he knew them, and listening to a song, and then he played a song. And of course, the greatness of this is that it was Jeff Healey, the brilliant singer and guitarist, at 9 years old. Wow. And there are lots of kids who do all sorts of things when they're young, and you just kind of never know what's going to happen with them. And it was kind of one of those brilliant moments for me to just say that it was a reminder to me how important encouraging young people to do interesting things and to allow them to run with their dreams. So here was, one of the greatest Canadian, guitar players
Yeah.
and blues singers ever. And there he was at 9 years old, loving music and playing the guitar the same way he played it, later on, across his knees. So it was pretty cool.
Wow. So obviously you wouldn't have known that Jeff Healey would become what he became, but at the time that Martin Short and John Candy were on, were they established at all? Like, how did you swing getting them on the show? Were they just members of ACTRA that you pulled in?
Yeah, it was. We did general casting calls. George Bourne was a talent coordinator at TVOntario, and we'd say, "Well, we need somebody to play X, Y, or Z," and we'd audition a bunch of people, and you auditioned almost all the people who did Second City in Toronto, and it was, there were a lot of very fine, comedians, musical theater people, terrific actors. Who we auditioned, and I'm sure lots of people we saw that we didn't hire, and you kind of scratch your head and say, "Clive, what were you thinking of?" But it was. This was part of the. Other people sometimes hired people because of their track record, because of their their reputation. And I hired people based on, this is the character that we wanted for the show, and I wanted to see whether they could do a really good job. And in a lot of cases, the brilliant performers did a great job. I mean, Marty Short as Smokey the Hare, not Smokey the Bear, or Smokey the Hare, delivers two of the finest, vocal renditions I've ever heard in my life. Just up there with the greats. Now, it doesn't surprise you now because of how brilliantly talented he is, but he was at, I don't know, was he 24 or 23 years old? Just straight out of McMaster University, and just starting a career. And I guess on his way to Godspell, and then Second City, and then Saturday Night Live, and then Hollywood, and
it's incredible.
But just yeah. I mean, it was a wonderful creative time for me, but also for other people in that industry.
Now, you had mentioned that Heather Conkey had played a role on the pilot. And I was interested to find out when I was talking with Heather that her first job at TVOntario in the same year, 1974, was a host on Polka Dot Door. Had you seen her on Polka Dot Door, or what was the connection there to get Heather to come in and do it?
Well, you say it as if it was a hard job to get actors to come in and actually be paid. So I mean, remember, these are young people who were desperate, to get jobs and to work and that kind of stuff. So it was, we weren't asking, established Hollywood stars. We were asking young people who were just at the beginning of their careers, and there were. We could have auditioned. We auditioned, dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of people, of talented people, and it was people were glad for the work.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Were you aware that Heather had been on Polka Dot Door, or was she just another?
Yes, I'd heard of her, and but I didn't really know her work that much. But we were looking for two enthusiastic, energetic hosts who could sing and dance and represent the show.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Obviously, I was wrong because I didn't hire them for the series.
And this is a great segue into the people that you did hire for the series. Tell us a little bit about casting Alex Laurier and Nikki Tilrow to play Moose and Beaver.
Well, Alex had a wonderful slapstick sense of humor, and he was just kind of, and physically tall, and so kind of a goofy, lumbering. He had wonderful voices and a kind of lovely comic appeal. And to contrast with that, Nikki Tilrow was one of the greatest puppeteers that this country's ever had. She was a beautiful ballet dancer, and also had a lovely voice as well. And so the two of them, were kind of the yin and the yang. The tall, the short, the bumbling, the beautiful dancer, so I was looking for that kind of contrast. I was looking for some kind of symbiotic relationship between them, and they paired up very well. Both very hard workers too. So I was lucky to get the two of them.
And again, we see the Polka Dot Door connection, because many people that grew up in the 70s remember Alex Laurier being on Polka Dot Door, really in the very beginning years.
Yeah, so it looks like I stole everything from Polka Dot Door, doesn't it? Hey, Noreen Virgin on today's special did Polka Dot Door. So
that's right.
And literally in that one, I went to the set of Polka Dot Door and watched her perform before I invited her to do today's special. So yeah, okay, I stole everything from Polka Dot Door.
Well, you know what? It's funny. I think I've mentioned this to you before, but there was this underground rumor amongst fans that people had a memory of Noreen being on Polka Dot Door, and I don't know if she just did a couple of weeks, but for the longest time, many people are like, no, you're getting her mixed up. She was on today's special. She was never on Polka Dot Door. And then a number of years ago, my friend Ed Conroy, who runs TVOntario, uncovered a clip showing that she was actually on the show. And it's funny, when you take stuff off tapes, sometimes you just get at the very end of the tape. And from what Ed tells me, this clip of Noreen, and I've seen it, it has enough to show the intro to the show and just about 10 seconds, but that's all you got, and then the tape actually ran out. So, but it was proof enough to settle the rumors and that they were true. Were there other... Sorry, go on.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, were there any other notable personalities from TVOntario involved in the show or that made guest appearances? I know you mentioned Heather Conkey. Was there anybody else, either in the crew that you would, or even in guest appearances that you would later work on in other shows or even today's special?
Well, the technical crew was a crew that we used all the time. We always tried to get the very best people at TVOntario. Brian Elston edited the show. He was absolutely terrific, and George Claridge did audio, and I worked with all these people as often as I could. You develop a trust with your team. They know. They bring high standards to the show, and so you don't have to worry about that part of the show. So, Chris Adeney designed the sets, and DSA created the sets, and so. When you find people that you think are really first class, you continue to work with them. Jane Downey worked on some of it with me. John Day. So there were a number of people that although this was pretty early in TVOntario's history, and many of the people I worked with later were still in high school when I was doing Cucumber.
Wow. Now, Cucumber seemed to enjoy a long run on TVO. What was the initial response in the 70s when it first aired? Did it earn a following of fans? Were there kids regularly tuning in?
Yes, it was. It didn't get the numbers. TVOntario didn't get the numbers that it got later on when today's special came along. In fact, one of the ironies of the show is that we wanted to be interactive. We wanted children to be a part of the show. We wanted children to care about the show. So you could join the Cucumber Club, right? And you'd get a button and you'd get a magazine. But it became, a real burden for TVOntario because there were all these people wanting buttons and magazines, and so it was an ancillary cost to the show so sometimes your success can get in the way. And particularly, with TVOntario, they were trying to repeat the show. They repeated the show over and over, and so there were still lots of mail coming into the show on repeats. So.
Now, that led into my next question. Aside from the buttons and the books, which I have actually seen somebody posted on a webpage online, one of the copies of the certificate saying that I'm part of the Cucumber Club. Aside from the books or the magazine and the button. Now, was the magazine like a regular thing, or was it just like you're part of the club? Here's a magazine.
I think we did two of them. I
Okay.
think that's and then it became too expensive.
Right. Was there any other merchandise generated for the show aside from the buttons and the magazine?
No, this was really pre Barney, pre Sesame Street, pre all that. Well, Sesame Street was going, but it was the merchandising wasn't on anybody's mind.
Right. Now, did you save any of that by chance, or is that all gone away now?
I have most of the material that I have from TVOntario is in the Ryerson library.
Okay.
The library archives. So in fact, I'd forgotten that I'd given it to them because I was looking for it last night to try to remind myself of the show because I knew you would ask me this question.
Well, I might just have to make a trip to Ryerson. Any particular memorable moments from Cucumber or any funny stories from any tapings that you can remember offhand?
Well, this was an early time. The only part of Cucumber that I directed was the mail rooms. And I was just a fledgling, I started directing when I went to Math Patrol and Math Makers before I got to Today's Special. And, the thing and from a learning experience, it was wonderful. I mean, first of all, Jim Calistro, who was the choreographer and the stager of the show, was really, he was a brilliant guy, and he got the movement and the flow and the character of the performers. He was terrific. He also did Monkey Bars with Bill Hartley, and he was, so he deserves an awful lot of the credit for how the show felt and looked, the movement in the show. But kind of what I learned, I cut my teeth on that show, and I watched as the pros lit it and did sound and edited it. Because I wasn't in the control room when it was being shot, I was with the different members of the crew, and it was that's kind of how I learned how a television production should be done, and also learned through the grimaces how it shouldn't be done. And there is a great story. I remember once we had a character on the show, and it was an unusual character, and I asked the floor director why he was behaving so oddly, and he always raised his arm up like this in front of him when he was saying something, and it was turns out that he had written his script on his white shirt, and that was the only way he could remember his lines. So he'd gesture so he could read his lines.
Oh my goodness! Wow. Well, Clive, tell me, how do you feel Cucumber fits into your resume and contributions to Canadian educational television? Where does this fit?
You ask really tough questions, Travis. I've really been blessed. I mean, who else is told? Who else says to somebody, well, I'd like to do a children's show, and they say, well, we're thinking of doing one. Why don't you do one and come back with the idea? And then do the pilot. And I mean, the pilot was really rough. It had to be shot very quickly, and they should have dumped me. Instead, they brought me back to do the series, but I learned so much through the process and the people that we got to work with, and the brilliant people that you were around, and you just kind of you contribute as much as you can, then you let them do their work. And I mean, imagine working with all those brilliant performers at that time, and Joanne Hauser's spectacular scripts and Manta Sound, and it was just it was a spectacular time. Partly because it was a place unlike any other place that I know of at that time, and certainly in Canada, that really respected children, that cared desperately for children. I'm sure Sesame Street did. Children's Television Workshop was brilliant in the States. But most children's programs at that time were kind of throwaway shows. We better do something for those little kids and just don't spend a lot of money. And in this case, children was really important at TVOntario. It should have been. I mean, it was educational television. We had a mandate. We had a curricular mandate. Schools were using the programs. So there was a lot of work put into the program and a lot of care put into it. And I feel, really grateful to TVOntario to have an opportunity to work in an environment where kids were really important. And of course, for me, that translated into, in 35, 40 years in children's television. And, but those were and, subsequent years were brilliant times to be producing. It was a great place to produce.
And that really segues into kind of the final section that I want to talk about with you today. And that is really what you did from Cucumber really to today's special, because I know you did a handful of children's series, and you've mentioned a couple already. But I'm wondering if you could just share the titles again of the shows that you worked on from Cucumber to today's special, and maybe just give us a quick snapshot about what the show was about, and maybe something interesting about it that may come to your memory as you talk about it.
Sure. I did Cucumber for 2 years, and then my new boss, Ruth Vernon, decided that, and I think with mandate from the ministry, decided that to concentrate more on curricular programs. And so I did a show called Math Patrol, and then for mathematics and kids grades 1 to 3, and then a show called Math Makers for kids in grades 4 to 6. And those were companion pieces to read along and read all about it. Jeremy Pollock did. So Ruth was doing math shows and language shows. She also did French shows and science shows, but those were the core. Math and English were the core shows that we did for the next 5 or 6 years. Then in '79 started Today's Special and did that for 8 years. And after that did a show called Roots and Wings, and after that, or a pilot called Roots and Wings, and after that did a pilot called McCabe Mysteries. And then left TVOntario and went to teach at Ryerson.
Now, you had mentioned, Clive, that the puppet for Sam Crenshaw had been featured in a series pilot prior to Today's Special. Do you remember the name of that?
It was called Music Inc.
Okay.
It was again one of those programs that we did. Again, this is the theme. The theme of our conversation here, Travis, is bend like a willow and try to live within the restrictions that you find yourself with. I think this is a good story. Coming up to, I guess it was probably December of a year just before Today's Special, so it might have been 1978 probably. They weren't using TVOntario for some reason, because of its programming structure, wasn't using its little internal studio very much. And that meant that there were crews that were assigned for that studio weren't being utilized. And the head of programming, knew that if he didn't utilize those studios, he had to pay the crews anyway. So he put out a call to people in TVOntario to come up with ideas for shows that could be shot in the little studio at TVOntario and had to be finished by March 31st, because that's when the money disappeared, right? And so a number of people. The lawyer for TVOntario came up with a program idea. The station manager came up with a program idea, because you understand, you know that everybody is a frustrated producer, creative producer, and no matter what job, sometimes they want to have jobs that actually pay money instead of being in the creative part of it. But so I came up with this idea for a music show called Music Inc. Because I wanted to do, really what I wanted to do is I wanted to do a music show for kids in grades 1 to 3. And so, I came up with the idea for the show. There was a little bit of money to do the show, and I was able to get the Canadian Brass to agree to do the show. And we did it with a couple of puppets, and built by Noreen Young in Ottawa. And one of them was a puppet that she worked, and another was a puppet that Bob Dermer, who was Sam in Today's Special, worked, and so it was a Sam Crenshaw puppet. And I liked the puppet so much. The pilot didn't go to series, won a lot of awards, but didn't go to series, and the Canadian Brass were spectacular in it. But I liked the character of Sam so much that when we were doing Today's Special, I thought, well, let's use Bobby Dermer in Today's Special, and that's so again, a kind of history of where it came from.
Who, by the way, is just an incredible guy. I've had the opportunity now to have lunch and dinner with Bobby, and he is just an incredible, incredible person. Now tell me this, was the character the same in Music Inc. as it was in Today's Special? Was it still Sam?
Well, yes, it was Sam Crenshaw, yes.
Okay.
But as you know, that the pilots in Today's Special, we used Sam Crenshaw very much as the person who was in Music Inc. for the pilots of Today's Special. But then once we did the pilots and we did all the research on the pilots, we modified Sam's character, because although he was the character that we had written, and the character that Bobby played was very appealing to adults, it wasn't as appealing to children. And it wasn't Bobby Dermer. It was my issue. So we kind of remolded the character, made him more less language oriented, more physical comedy. And so that was and children responded to that much better. So
it's interesting.
It's interesting.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, Clive. I actually have on loan from Clive Vanderburgh that report that talks about the two pilots of Today's Special and the changes that they wanted done. As well, Joanne Hauser wrote Hats, but Clive Vanderburgh wrote Snow, and he let me borrow the actual original script for that, which was very, very interesting to see. So would it be accurate then, Clive, to say that the character of Sam Crenshaw, including his name, really originated with this Music Inc. pilot and then was later drafted over to Today's Special? Is that correct?
Yes.
Wow.
Music Inc. was written by Joanne Hauser.
Okay. Very interesting. Very interesting. Well, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate your time, and I know that there's a lot of viewers out there that are going to be flooded back with memories just based on some of the stories that you have shown. And we're always searching for episodes of Cucumber, and who knows what will arise in the future and what can be enjoyed down the road. But thank you so much for your time. I know we'll talk for a couple of seconds afterwards, but thank you so much for this interview again, Clive, and thank you for sharing your heart and your contributions to Canadian children's television.
Thank you, Travis, for doing this. This is you're doing something great here in interviewing people who work so hard.
I appreciate it, Clive. Thanks.